The courtroom and the challenge. The courtroom buzzed with subdued whispers, a murmur of judgment and expectation filling the air. The oak-paneled walls seemed to close in as the weight of anticipation pressed down on everyone present. At the center of it all stood a young black girl, no older than 17. Her presence was an anomaly, not just because of her age, but because of the unshakable calm she radiated. She wore a simple outfit, a crisp white blouse tucked into navy slacks, her sneakers looking almost out of place on the polished courtroom floor. Her hair was tied back neatly, her face framed by natural curls that seemed to catch the light. But what struck everyone was the way she carried herself. Harper Freeman didn't fidget, didn't falter under the dozens of eyes trained on her. She was a defendant, yet she stood with the poise of someone who had been here before, someone who belonged. Judge Harold Brenner, an older man with a gruff demeanor, loomed over the proceedings from his elevated bench. His black robe was slightly rumpled, as if it had been thrown on at the last minute, and his expression bore the weariness of a man who thought he had seen it all. But today was different, though he didn't know it yet. "Miss Freeman," he said, drawing out her last name with deliberate disdain, "do you even understand the gravity of what you're being accused of here?" The whispers in the gallery quieted instantly. People shifted in their seats, leaning forward as if the young girl's response would be worth hearing. Harper tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanging, her voice clear. "Yes, Your Honor. I understand." The judge raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "Do you now? Because this isn't some after-school club debate. This is a court of law." A few muffled chuckles rippled through the gallery. Harper glanced at the crowd, her eyes sweeping over the suited men and women who stared back at her as if she were an exhibit. Their expressions were hard and unyielding, masks of judgment that made no effort to hide their disdain. She let the moment stretch, meeting their gazes with a calm intensity that silenced even the whispers. "Your Honor," Harper said finally, her voice steady, "I assure you, I'm well aware of the seriousness of these proceedings." The judge leaned forward, clearly unimpressed. "Then you must also realize how unusual, no, absurd, it is for someone like you to represent yourself in a matter like this." Harper's lips parted slightly, as if to respond, but she hesitated. Instead, she allowed a faint smile to tug at the corners of her mouth, a look of quiet confidence that sent another ripple through the courtroom. The gallery shifted again, a murmur of curiosity replacing the earlier dismissiveness. She wasn't acting like a typical defendant, and the room could feel it. "Let's get this farce over with," Judge Brenner muttered, flipping open the file on his desk. "Prosecution may proceed." The district attorney, a tall, polished man with slicked back hair, stood up with a practiced air of authority. His movements were deliberate, his voice smooth as he addressed the court. "Your Honor," he began, "this case is as straightforward as they come. The defendant was found at the scene, in possession of materials that—" "Objection." The single word cut through the room like a knife, sharp and unexpected. The district attorney froze mid-sentence, spinning to face the girl who had spoken it. The gallery erupted into whispers again, a low buzz of incredulity and intrigue. Judge Brenner slammed his gavel down, the loud crack silencing the crowd. "Objection." The judge's tone was a mix of disbelief and annoyance. "Miss Freeman, do you even know what that means?" "Yes, Your Honor," Harper replied without hesitation. "The prosecution is making assumptions about my intent without providing factual context. That's speculative and inadmissible." The courtroom was stunned into silence. The district attorney, visibly rattled, struggled to compose himself. "Your Honor, this is—" "Miss Freeman," the judge interrupted, his tone growing sharper, "you are here to defend yourself, not to disrupt these proceedings. One more outburst like that, and I'll hold you in contempt." "Understood, Your Honor," Harper said evenly, her voice betraying no fear or frustration. The district attorney cleared his throat, regaining his composure. "As I was saying," he continued, his smirk returning, The evidence is overwhelming and leaves no room for. Permission to approach the bench, Your Honor, Harper interjected. This time, the courtroom erupted into audible gasps. The judge's eyebrows shot up, and he stared at Harper as if she had grown a second head. You don't get to make demands in my courtroom, Judge Brenner barked. I'm not making a demand, Your Honor, Harper countered. I'm exercising my right to present a fair defense. The judge leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of irritation. Fine. Approach. Harper stepped forward, her sneakers squeaking slightly on the polished floor. She moved with a confidence that made the gallery sit up straighter, their curiosity now fully piqued. In her hands was a thick stack of neatly organized papers. She placed them on the judge's bench with deliberate care, her hand steady as she slid them forward. This, she said, her voice measured, is a preliminary review of the evidence submitted by the prosecution. If you'll notice, much of it is circumstantial and lacks proper chain of custody. Judge Brenner's eyes narrowed as he picked up the stack of papers. He flipped through them, his frown deepening with every page. The district attorney, who had been pacing impatiently, finally exploded. Your Honor, this is outrageous. She's wasting the court's time. The judge held up a hand, silencing him. His attention remained on the papers Harper had submitted. When he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable. Miss Freeman, he said slowly, where did you get this? I prepared it myself, Your Honor, she replied. And how? He asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Does a teenager like you know how to prepare something like this? Harper paused for a moment, her gaze steady as she met his eyes. Then, with a calmness that left the room breathless, she said, because I've studied the law. The gallery erupted once more, the whispers swelling into an audible roar of disbelief. Judge Brenner slammed his gavel down repeatedly, shouting for order. But even as the room descended into chaos, Harper stood there, unmoved, her expression as composed as ever. What the room didn't yet realize was that Harper Freeman wasn't who they thought she was. She had come prepared, not just to clear her name, but to turn their assumptions on their heads. This was only the beginning, and by the time she was done, they would all see her for what she truly was, a force to be reckoned with. The revelation and the stakes. The courtroom's cacophony of murmurs and gasps slowly settled under the heavy authority of Judge Brenner's gavel. The room's tension, however, had transformed. What was once a scene of casual disdain for a teenage defendant now bristled with a new undercurrent, curiosity and unease. Harper Freeman had shattered their assumptions with a single statement, and it was clear she wasn't finished. Judge Brenner's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edges of the stack of papers she had submitted. He leaned forward, his piercing gaze narrowing at the young girl before him. Miss Freeman, he said, his tone quieter now, but no less probing. You've studied the law, you say. How exactly does a 17-year-old come to possess this kind of knowledge? I'd like to hear it, and I imagine everyone else in this room would too. Harper's calm demeanor didn't falter. She clasped her hands in front of her, standing steady against the wave of incredulity rolling through the gallery. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady and firm. I spent years preparing for moments like this. While others underestimated me, I made it my mission to learn, to excel, and to prove that intelligence and determination aren't bound by age. The judge arched an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. That's an inspiring sentiment, Miss Freeman, he said with a hint of sarcasm. But we're not here for a motivational speech. Facts, please. How did you learn? A faint smile tugged at the corner of Harper's lips. She took a deep breath and began her story. When I was 10, my father was falsely accused of a crime he didn't commit. He couldn't afford a good lawyer, and he ended up spending 3 years in prison before we finally proved his innocence. During those years, I saw how the system works, or, more often, how it fails people who look like me. I swore I'd never let that happen to anyone I cared about again. The gallery was silent, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. Even the district attorney, who had been fidgeting impatiently, froze as he listened. Harper continued, her voice unwavering. I started reading everything I could get my hands on. Case law, legal textbooks, trial transcripts, anything that would help me understand how the system operates. By the time I was 14, I had convinced a local attorney to let me intern at her firm. She saw my potential and mentored me. I graduated high school at 15 and earned my pre-law degree by 16. The judge's eyes narrowed further, skepticism etched across his face. And the California bar exam, he pressed. That's not something you just pass on a whim. Harper's smile widened slightly. No, Your Honor, it's not. I studied relentlessly, balancing my coursework and preparation. Last year, I passed the exam on my first attempt. I became one of the youngest licensed attorneys in the state. The words hung in the air like a bombshell. Gasps erupted from the gallery once again, and the courtroom descended into chaos as people whispered furiously, trying to process what they had just heard. Judge Brenner slammed his gavel repeatedly, his voice booming over the din. Order. I will have order in this courtroom. The noise subsided, but the atmosphere remained electric. The judge turned to his clerk, his expression unreadable. Verify that, he said curtly. The clerk nodded and began typing furiously on her keyboard. The district attorney, however, had reached his breaking point. He shot up from his seat, his face flushed with frustration. Your Honor, this is absurd. She's manipulating the court with a fabricated story. She's not, the clerk interrupted, her voice cutting through the room. All eyes turned to her as she looked up from her computer screen, her expression stunned. Harper Freeman is a registered attorney with the State Bar of California. The records confirm it. The courtroom erupted yet again, louder this time. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, some of them whispering into their phones. A few audience members openly gawked at Harper, their faces a mix of disbelief and admiration. Judge Brenner held up a hand, his face now pale. Quiet, he demanded, though his voice lacked its usual authority. He turned his attention back to Harper, his skepticism melting into something else, something bordering on respect. You're telling me, he said slowly, that you're not only representing yourself in this case, but that you've also already proven yourself capable of practicing law. Yes, Your Honor, Harper replied, her voice firm. And I intend to prove that my rights were violated, and that this case lacks the evidence required to proceed. The judge studied her for a long moment, his eyes scanning her face as if trying to detect any hint of deceit. Finally, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. Very well, Miss Freeman. Let's see what you've got. The district attorney's face turned a deep shade of crimson as he sat back down, his hands trembling slightly. He flipped through his notes, muttering under his breath, clearly trying to regain his composure. Harper, however, remained standing, her posture impeccable. The first issue, she began, addressing both the judge and the gallery, is the prosecution's reliance on circumstantial evidence. For example, Exhibit B, the surveillance footage that allegedly places me at the scene of the crime. She walked to the defense table, picking up a neatly bound report. This footage lacks a timestamp, and it was retrieved from an unverified source. Both of these issues violate the chain of custody, making the evidence inadmissible. Additionally, I have an independent forensic analysis here that outlines discrepancies in the footage. May I submit this to the court? The judge nodded, gesturing for the bailiff to collect the report. The bailiff delivered it to the bench, and Judge Brenner began flipping through it. His expression grew darker with each passing moment. This raises serious concerns, he muttered, his voice low. He turned to the district attorney. Do you have an explanation for this? The attorney hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as though searching for the right words. Your Honor, he stammered. The footage is reliable. Is it? Harper interjected, her voice cutting him off. Because I have documentation that suggests otherwise. The inconsistencies include mismatched shadows, indicating potential tampering. The gallery buzzed again, the whispers growing louder. Judge Brenner raised his hand for silence, his gaze fixed on the district attorney. "I'm inclined to agree with Miss Freeman," he said, his tone cold. "This evidence is flawed." The district attorney's frustration boiled over. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." "What's highly irregular," Harper interrupted once more, her tone sharper now, "is how this case was built on assumptions and incomplete evidence. Let's move to Exhibit D, the so-called confession." The attorney froze, his eyes narrowing as Harper picked up another document. "This confession," she continued, "was obtained after hours of interrogation without legal counsel present. As a minor, I was entitled to representation, and yet my requests were ignored. Under federal law, this is a clear violation of my rights." Judge Brenner's expression darkened further as he looked at the district attorney. "Is this true?" The attorney stammered, his hands fumbling with his notes. "Well, technically nothing," Harper cut in, her voice now carrying an edge of anger. "This isn't just about technicalities. This is about justice. The prosecution assumed I wouldn't fight back, that I wouldn't know my rights. They underestimated me, as did many in this room. But I've worked too hard to let this stand." The courtroom fell silent once more, the weight of her words settling over everyone like a heavy blanket. Judge Brenner studied her, his expression unreadable. Finally, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Miss Freeman," he said quietly, "you've certainly given us a lot to think about. This court will recess briefly while I review the evidence." Harper nodded, returning to her seat. As the judge stood and exited the room, the gallery erupted into hushed conversations, the weight of the moment undeniable. For Harper, this was just the beginning. The real fight was yet to come. The evidence breaks, and the battle intensifies. The courtroom was a sea of murmurs and whispers as Harper Freeman sat calmly at the defense table, her gaze steady, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Her heart raced beneath the composed exterior, but she didn't let it show. The stakes were higher than ever now. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a battle for respect, for justice, and for a chance to rewrite a narrative that society had written for her long before she had walked into this courtroom. Across the room, the district attorney, Christopher Hensley, shuffled his papers with a look of barely concealed frustration. His previously polished demeanor had cracked, and sweat beaded on his forehead as he glanced toward the gallery. The courtroom was still abuzz, the audience clearly rattled by the young defendant's surprising command of the law. Harper had forced everyone to confront their assumptions, and now the DA was struggling to regain control of a case he thought was already won. Judge Harold Brenner re-entered the courtroom, his black robe billowing behind him like a storm cloud. The gavel cracked down with a sharp authority, and the room fell silent once again. His face was tight with concentration, his gaze flickering between the defendant and the prosecution. "Miss Freeman," he began, his voice gruff, but lacking the earlier condescension, "your arguments regarding Exhibit B and Exhibit D have raised serious questions about the admissibility of the evidence presented by the prosecution. However, we are not here to debate hypotheticals. I need to hear more from you to determine whether this case should proceed." Harper rose to her feet, her every movement measured and deliberate. She exuded a calm that belied her age, and the gallery watched her with rapt attention. Even the reporters had stopped scribbling in their notepads, their pens hovering as they waited to catch every word. "Thank you, Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and steady. "If I may, I'd like to address the prosecution's handling of Exhibit A, the physical evidence allegedly found at the scene." Judge Brenner gestured for her to continue. "Proceed." Harper approached the bench, holding a single sheet of paper in her hand. "This," she said, her tone firm, "is a copy of the chain of custody report provided by the prosecution. As you'll see, there's a glaring issue. The evidence was logged in by Officer Daniels at 10:42 p.m., but it was initially recovered by Officer Tran at 9:15 p.m., nearly an hour and a half earlier. During that time, There's no record of where the evidence was or who had access to it. She handed the paper to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. As Judge Brenner scanned the document, his brow furrowed deeply. "And your point, Miss Freeman?" "My point, Your Honor," Harper continued, "is that this gap in the chain of custody renders the evidence unreliable. Without proper documentation, there's no way to ensure it wasn't tampered with, misplaced, or even fabricated." The district attorney sprang to his feet, his frustration finally boiling over. "Your Honor, this is preposterous. The evidence is legitimate, and these procedural issues are minor at best." Harper turned to him, her expression unwavering. "Minor procedural issues? Is that how you describe a clear violation of legal standards designed to protect the integrity of the justice system? If the prosecution can't guarantee the authenticity of their evidence, how can this court rely on it to determine my guilt or innocence?" The gallery murmured again, a ripple of unease spreading through the room. Harper had shifted the narrative once more, placing the burden squarely back on the prosecution. Judge Brenner held up a hand to silence the growing noise. "Mr. Hensley," he said, his voice colder now, "do you have an explanation for this gap in the chain of custody?" Hensley hesitated, his confidence visibly eroding. "Your Honor, the evidence was handled according to standard procedures. Officer Tran and Officer Daniels are both experienced professionals, and there's no reason to suspect." "Suspect what?" Harper interjected, her voice sharp. "That mistakes happen. That protocols are sometimes ignored. Without proper documentation, suspicion isn't just reasonable, it's inevitable." Judge Brenner nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the prosecutor. "She has a point, Mr. Hensley. This is a serious oversight." Hensley's face turned a deep shade of red, and he clenched his jaw tightly. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we're allowing a child to derail these proceedings with technicalities." Harper's eyes flashed, but her tone remained calm. "Your Honor, these aren't technicalities. They're the foundation of a fair trial. If we ignore these issues, we're setting a dangerous precedent, one where rights and procedures can be disregarded whenever it's convenient." The gallery murmured louder now, and Harper could see the tide turning in her favor. Even some of the prosecution's supporters seemed to be shifting uncomfortably in their seats, their earlier confidence waning. She pressed on, determined to keep the momentum. "Furthermore," she continued, "the physical evidence itself is questionable. The prosecution claims it links me to the scene, but forensic analysis shows no fingerprints, no DNA, nothing to tie me to it. The only connection is proximity, a connection that is circumstantial at best." Judge Brenner leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he regarded her thoughtfully. "Miss Freeman, you've raised valid concerns about the evidence presented thus far. However, the prosecution still has other exhibits to rely on. What do you say to that?" Harper didn't miss a beat. "I say, Your Honor, that we should examine those exhibits with the same level of scrutiny. For example, Exhibit C, the witness statement. The individual in question, Mr. Nolan, claims to have seen someone matching my description near the scene. However, upon reviewing the original police report, I noticed an important detail." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. "Mr. Nolan stated that the suspect was wearing a red jacket. Your Honor, I was wearing this." She gestured to her white blouse and navy slacks on the night in question. "The officers who arrested me can corroborate that." Another gasp rippled through the gallery, and Harper could see the doubt spreading like wildfire. The district attorney looked as though he might combust on the spot, his face a mixture of fury and desperation. "Your Honor," Hensley sputtered, "this is a distraction. The defendant is cherry-picking details to muddy the waters." "This is called a defense, Mr. Hensley," Harper shot back, her voice firm. "And if the prosecution's case can be undermined by cherry-picked details, maybe it's not as strong as they claim." Judge Brenner rapped his gavel once, silencing the brewing argument. "Enough," he said, his tone decisive. "Miss Freeman has made her point. Mr. Hensley, If your case relies on evidence and witness testimony that cannot withstand basic scrutiny, you'll have a hard time convincing this court to proceed." Hensley sank back into his seat, his jaw tight. The tension in the room was palpable, the power dynamics shifting with every word Harper spoke. She had dismantled the prosecution's case piece by piece, and the gallery knew it. As Harper returned to her seat, she allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. She wasn't just defending herself. She was proving that intelligence, preparation, and truth could triumph over prejudice and assumptions. But she knew the fight wasn't over. There was still more to uncover, more to challenge. Harper Freeman wasn't finished yet, and the courtroom wasn't ready for what was coming next. Breaking through the facade. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to choke on, the kind that clung to the walls and hung in the air like an oppressive weight. Harper Freeman remained seated, her back straight, her hands folded on the table before her. The sharp clicks of the court stenographer's keys were the only sounds cutting through the silence, each keystroke punctuating the gravity of the moment. Across the room, District Attorney Christopher Hensley sat stiffly, his jaw clenched, and his hands gripping the edges of his desk. His polished facade, once so composed and confident, had begun to crack under the relentless pressure of Harper's meticulous defense. He glanced toward the judge, then the gallery, as if searching for an ally among the crowd. But the crowd's expressions told another story. Curiosity, doubt, even a flicker of admiration for the teenage defendant who was turning the tables. Judge Harold Brenner cleared his throat, his deep voice breaking the silence. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on Harper. "Miss Freeman, you've managed to discredit several key pieces of evidence. However," he paused, his tone deliberate, "I'd like to know how you intend to address the broader picture. The prosecution claims a motive. Do you deny having any connection to the alleged incident?" Harper stood, her movements slow and deliberate. Her calm demeanor hadn't faltered, but her eyes carried a spark of determination that was impossible to ignore. She turned to face the judge, her voice clear and unwavering. "Your Honor, the prosecution's claim of motive is based on a narrative they've constructed, one that lacks substantive evidence. Allow me to address their theory directly." She picked up a slim folder from the defense table and approached the bench. The bailiff took it from her and handed it to the judge, who began flipping through the documents. Harper continued, her voice carrying a quiet authority. "The prosecution alleges that I had a personal vendetta against the alleged victim, Mr. Horace Elston, and that I acted out of anger. However, their argument relies entirely on hearsay. The statements they've submitted are from individuals who have no direct knowledge of my actions or intentions." Hensley sprang to his feet, his voice bristling with frustration. "Your Honor, the statements come from credible sources Credible sources who were not present at the time of the incident," Harper interjected, her tone sharp but respectful. "Sources who, by their own admission, have a strained relationship with the truth." The judge raised a hand, signaling for both to pause. "Mr. Hensley, sit down. Miss Freeman, elaborate on this claim." Harper nodded, her posture unyielding. "The primary statement comes from a Mr. Devin Klein, who claimed to overhear a conversation where I allegedly expressed animosity toward Mr. Elston. However, Mr. Klein's credibility is questionable at best. He has a documented history of fabricating stories, including one instance in which he falsely accused another individual of theft. That case was dismissed after the court found his testimony unreliable." She turned to the gallery, her gaze sweeping across the audience before returning to the judge. "I have the court records here, Your Honor, if you'd like to review them." Judge Brenner gestured for the bailiff to retrieve the document she held. As he examined it, his frown deepened. "This does raise concerns," he muttered, flipping through the pages. "Mr. Hensley, did you vet this witness properly?" The DA bristled, his face flushing red. "Your Honor, the prosecution believes the witness to be credible. This is an attempt to discredit him with irrelevant." "It's not irrelevant if the witness has a history of lying under oath," Harper cut in, her voice steady. And it's not irrelevant if the prosecution is building its case on statements that cannot be verified. The gallery murmured again, the audience visibly swayed by Harper's argument. She had dismantled yet another pillar of the prosecution's case, and the momentum was unmistakably in her favor. But Harper wasn't done. Furthermore, she continued, I'd like to address the so-called motive. The prosecution claims that I targeted Mr. Elston out of personal animosity, yet they've failed to provide any evidence of a significant relationship between us. Mr. Elston and I have crossed paths exactly 3 times in my life, all in public settings. There are no phone records, no messages, no documented interactions that support their theory of a vendetta. Hensley leaped to his feet again, his composure slipping further. Your Honor, the defendant is cherry-picking evidence to paint herself as an innocent bystander. This case isn't just about her. It's about the impact her actions had on the victim and the community. Harper turned to face him, her expression calm but resolute. And yet, Mr. Hensley, you've failed to provide any evidence that proves I committed the actions you're accusing me of. Impact matters, but so does truth. Without truth, there can be no justice. The judge slammed his gavel, silencing the brewing tension. He turned to Hensley, his voice sharp. Mr. Hensley, you've been given every opportunity to present a strong case, yet so far, Miss Freeman has systematically dismantled your arguments. I suggest you focus on presenting concrete evidence, not speculation. Hensley sank back into his chair, his face a mix of fury and defeat. Harper returned to her seat as well, her heart pounding. She knew the fight wasn't over yet. The prosecution still had one last card to play. Miss Freeman, the judge said after a long pause, you've raised valid concerns about the evidence and witness testimony. However, I'm still interested in understanding your perspective. If you're innocent, as you claim, then why were you at the scene of the incident that night? The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Harper, the gallery leaning forward in anticipation. This was the question everyone had been waiting for. Harper took a deep breath before standing again. She looked directly at the judge, her voice quiet but firm. Your Honor, I was at the scene that night because I was helping a friend. A ripple of surprise swept through the room, and the gallery erupted into hushed whispers. Judge Brenner raised a hand for silence, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. Helping a friend, he repeated. Explain. Harper nodded, her hands gripping the edge of the defense table. My friend, Elena Martinez, called me that evening. She was panicked, scared. She'd been in an argument with Mr. Elston earlier that day, and she believed he might retaliate. She asked me to meet her at the community center where she was volunteering so she wouldn't be alone. I agreed. She paused, her voice growing heavier. When I arrived, Mr. Elston was already there, causing a scene. I stayed with Elena to make sure she was safe. That's the only reason I was anywhere near the incident. Judge Brenner leaned forward, his gaze sharp. Do you have any proof of this interaction? Witnesses? Phone records? Harper nodded again. I do, Your Honor. Elena is willing to testify, and I have the call logs to corroborate my story. The judge gestured for the bailiff to retrieve the documents. As he reviewed them, the tension in the room reached a fever pitch. The gallery watched in silence, their earlier skepticism replaced with a mix of awe and curiosity. After a long pause, Judge Brenner looked up. This court will recess while I review this new evidence, he said firmly. We'll reconvene in 30 minutes. The gavel cracked down, and the room erupted into noise as the judge left the bench. Harper sat down slowly, her hands trembling slightly now that the adrenaline had worn off. She had delivered her strongest argument yet, but she knew the battle was far from over. This wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about proving that justice could prevail, even against the steepest odds, and Harper Freeman was determined to see it through to the end. The truth surfaces. The courtroom remained tense as the recess came to an end, the once bustling gallery now sitting in hushed anticipation. The heavy oak doors swung open, and Judge Harold Brenner entered, his expression unreadable. The gavel struck once, silencing even the faintest whisper. Harper Freeman took her seat at the defense table, her every movement calm and deliberate. Yet inside, she felt the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. She knew this was it. The moment where all her preparation, all her resolve, would be tested against a system that had never been designed to believe in her. Across the room, District Attorney Christopher Hensley sat stiffly, his jaw tight and his frustration palpable. His arguments had been systematically dismantled, his case reduced to a collection of weak points held together by assumptions and conjecture. But Harper knew better than to underestimate him. He still had one final card to play. "Miss Freeman," Judge Brenner began, his voice measured but firm, "I've reviewed the documents you've submitted, including the call logs and the initial police report. Your claims regarding your presence at the scene are credible, but they do not fully absolve you of the allegations against you. The prosecution may proceed with any remaining evidence." Hensley stood, his hands clutching a thick manila folder as he approached the bench. He cleared his throat, his voice loud and forceful, in an attempt to regain control of the narrative. "Your Honor, while the defense has done an admirable job of raising doubts about certain elements of our case, the facts remain. The defendant was present at the scene, and while she claimed her intent was to help a friend, we have evidence that suggests otherwise." Harper raised an eyebrow, her gaze steady as Hensley retrieved a small black USB drive from his folder. "Your Honor," Hensley continued, "we have recovered additional footage from a nearby security camera that was not included in the original submission. This footage captures the moments leading up to the incident and provides a more complete picture of the defendant's actions." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Harper felt a chill run down her spine, but forced herself to remain composed. She couldn't afford to let doubt show. Not now. Judge Brenner gestured for the bailiff to collect the USB drive. "Play the footage," he ordered. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as a large screen on the wall flickered to life. The grainy footage began to play, showing a dimly lit street near the community center. The timestamp indicated the footage was captured shortly before the alleged incident. Harper watched closely as the video unfolded. She saw herself walking toward the building, her stride purposeful but unhurried. Moments later, another figure appeared, Mr. Horace Elston. He was gesturing wildly, his posture aggressive as he approached the entrance. Harper stopped short, turning slightly as if aware of his presence. The prosecution paused the video, and Hensley stepped forward. "Your Honor, as you can see, the defendant appears to have been following Mr. Elston. Her behavior is consistent with premeditation." Before Harper could respond, the judge turned to her. "Miss Freeman, would you care to explain this footage?" Harper stood, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the defense table. Her heart pounded, but her voice was steady. "Your Honor, this footage does not show what the prosecution claims. I was not following Mr. Elston. I was on my way to meet my friend, Alina Martins, as I've already stated. Mr. Elston's presence was coincidental." She stepped toward the monitor, gesturing to the paused frame. "If you look closely, you'll notice that I stop when I see him. That's not the behavior of someone pursuing a target. It's the reaction of someone who doesn't want to engage." The judge narrowed his eyes, studying the frame. "And what about the interaction that followed? Did you speak to Mr. Elston?" Harper nodded. "I did, Your Honor. He confronted me, accusing me of interfering in his business with Alina. I told him I was there to make sure she was safe. He left shortly after that, and I entered the community center." Hensley scoffed, his voice dripping with skepticism. "A convenient story, Miss Freeman, but it doesn't change the fact that you were present when the alleged incident occurred." Harper turned to face him, her expression unyielding. "And yet your case relies on assumptions rather than facts. You have no evidence that I had any involvement in what happened after Mr. Elston left the scene." Hensley clenched his jaw, his frustration mounting. He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this footage raises serious questions about the defendant's intentions. I request that the court consider it as evidence of her involvement." Judge Brenner leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the screen. "Miss Freeman," he said after a long pause, "you've provided an explanation for the footage, but I need to understand something. If Mr. Elston confronted you, as you claim, why didn't you report it to the authorities?" Harper took a deep breath. "Your Honor, I didn't report it because I didn't believe it was necessary. At the time, it seemed like a verbal altercation that had been resolved. I had no reason to believe it would escalate further." The judge's expression remained unreadable as he nodded slowly. "Very well. Mr. Hensley, do you have anything further to add?" Hensley hesitated, his shoulders sagging slightly. "No, Your Honor," he said finally, his voice subdued. The gallery buzzed again, the tide of opinion shifting further in Harper's favor. She returned to her seat, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the table. She had faced every argument, every accusation, and she had held her ground. But she knew the battle wasn't over yet. Judge Brenner rapped his gavel once, silencing the room. "This court will now deliberate on the evidence presented. We will reconvene shortly with a decision." The gavel struck again, and the room erupted into chaos as the judge exited. Harper sat still, her composure intact even as her mind raced. She had come this far, but she knew the hardest part was yet to come. The truth was out, but would it be enough to set her free? Victory in the balance. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that seemed to stretch infinitely, swallowing time and space. Harper Freeman sat motionless at the defense table, her face composed, but her mind racing. The weight of everything she had fought for pressed against her chest. It wasn't just her freedom at stake. It was the vindication of her hard work, her defiance against a system that had sought to underestimate her at every turn. Judge Harold Brenner re-entered the room, his gavel echoing like a thunderclap as it struck the bench. The gallery quieted instantly, the air thick with tension. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised above notepads. The audience, once skeptical and dismissive, now watched Harper with rapt attention. She had transformed in their eyes, from a frightened teenager to a formidable force challenging the very fabric of their assumptions. "Miss Freeman," the judge began, his voice slow and deliberate, "this court has carefully reviewed all the evidence, arguments, and testimony presented during this trial. Before I deliver my ruling, I want to commend you for your conduct and composure throughout these proceedings." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Harper met the judge's gaze steadily, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She nodded slightly, acknowledging his words without breaking her calm exterior. Judge Brenner continued, his tone measured. "This case has brought to light several troubling inconsistencies in the prosecution's approach, including lapses in the chain of custody, unreliable witness testimony, and evidence that fails to meet the standard of admissibility. Additionally, the defendant has presented credible explanations for her actions on the night in question, supported by corroborating documents and testimony." The district attorney, Christopher Hensley, sat rigid at his table, his face pale and his jaw clenched. Harper could feel the weight of his frustration, but she refused to let it distract her. Her focus remained on the judge. "However," Brenner said, his voice dropping slightly, "this court must also consider the gravity of the accusations. While the prosecution's case is undeniably flawed, the question remains whether the defendant's actions warrant further scrutiny." Harper's heart pounded in her chest. She tightened her grip on the edge of the table, forcing herself to breathe evenly. This was the moment of truth. The judge paused, glancing briefly at the notes before him. When he looked up again, his gaze was sharp and unwavering. "Miss Freeman," he said, "this court finds that the prosecution has failed to meet its burden of proof. The evidence presented does not support the charges against you, and the procedural errors further undermine the integrity of the case. Therefore, I have no choice but to dismiss all charges. You are free to go." The gavel struck, and the courtroom erupted. The gallery was a whirlwind of applause, gasps, and murmurs. Reporters scrambled to capture the scene, their pens flying across notepads as they jotted down every detail of the landmark moment. Even some of the prosecution's supporters clapped hesitantly, acknowledging the sheer brilliance Harper had displayed. Harper remained seated for a moment, the judge's words sinking in. She had won. Not just the case, but the respect of everyone in that room. Slowly, she rose to her feet, her movements deliberate. She turned to the gallery, her eyes scanning the sea of faces, some surprised, some in awe, and a few still skeptical. But one thing was clear. No one doubted her anymore. Judge Brenner cleared his throat, silencing the commotion. "Miss Freeman," he said, his tone softer now, "you have shown remarkable skill and poise in this courtroom. While your actions tonight cleared your name, I hope you understand the greater responsibility that comes with the talent you've demonstrated." Harper nodded, her voice steady as she replied, "Thank you, Your Honor. I understand, and I intend to use what I've learned to make a difference." The judge gave a small nod, a flicker of respect passing over his face. "Good. I expect we'll see more of you in courtrooms, though perhaps on the other side of the bench." With that, he rose and exited the room, leaving behind an energy that was almost electric. As Harper gathered her papers, she felt a hand on her shoulder. Turning, she saw Elena Martinez, her friend, her reason for being at the community center that night. Elena's eyes glistened with tears as she embraced Harper tightly. "You did it," Elena whispered. "You actually did it." Harper pulled back, her faint smile breaking through. "I didn't just do it for me," she said softly. "This was for all the people who've been underestimated, dismissed, or silenced. I wanted to show them that we can fight back." The reporters swarmed as Harper and Elena walked toward the doors, their questions flying in rapid succession. "Miss Freeman, what's next for you? How does it feel to have won against such overwhelming odds? Do you plan to continue practicing law?" Harper paused briefly, turning to face the cameras. "This isn't about me," she said firmly. "It's about justice. The system is flawed, but it's not unchangeable. Today wasn't just a victory for me. It was a reminder that we all have a voice, and when we use it, we can create change." With that, she pushed open the heavy oak doors, stepping into the sunlight. The crowd outside erupted into cheers and applause, people holding signs of support and shouting her name. Harper looked at them, at the sea of faces that had come to witness this moment, and felt a surge of hope. As she walked down the courthouse steps, Elena at her side, she knew this was just the beginning. There would be more battles to fight, more people to defend, and more truths to uncover. But today, she had proven something powerful, that even in the face of overwhelming odds, justice could prevail. Harper Freeman had rewritten the rules, and the world would never see her the same way again.